We invited John Richter here to talk to us about basically legislation. And he's the chair of the policy committee of the Great Lakes Renewable Energy Association. That's GLREA in short. And he's also on the board of directors. He's an expert witness at the Michigan Public Service Commission and has presented to the U.S. congressional staff on wind energy policy impacts. He has presented renewable energy policy recommendations to the Michigan legislature and staff. He's taught solar energy at Macomb Community College, and he's been a regular speaker at renewable energy conferences for more than 3 decades. John, I'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll start with, who is the Great Lakes Renewable Energy Associations? We're a nonprofit 501c3. We were founded in 1991, actually by a group of solar installers who kind of got tired of answering individually with potential customers the same questions over and over again. You know, does solar work in Michigan? It was a thing back then. Anyway, so they founded the organization really to do education and to promote renewable energy and energy efficiency in Michigan. We do weekly educational webinars, usually 3 weeks or sometimes 4 weeks a month. One of those we'll just do like an open question and answer session, right? We have experts on the line. People come in with whatever they want to know about. Importantly, and particularly my role, we intervene in electric utility cases before the Public Service Commission. We are certainly promoting, utility renewable energy and closing the coal plants, but we kind of have a special focus on customer-owned solar systems and how to promote that. Our website is glrea.org. We're a membership organization. Annual dues is $30 for an individual. We also have business memberships, so it's pretty affordable. And all of our webinars are also recorded and put on our YouTube channel. So if you go on YouTube and search Great Lakes Renewable Energy Association, it will come up.
I'd like to say too that the weekly webinars are actually available to anybody, and they encourage membership, but you can also attend any of the weekly webinars that are of interest to you.
Thank you, Nikki. That's a very good point. Disclaimer, so everything I say here is my opinion and does not necessarily reflect the organization. All right, who am I? Actually, the intro was very good on that. I became obsessed with energy in 1973 with the Arab oil embargo. I was in junior high at the time, so I got a good early start. I went off and made a living doing software development, but while I was doing that, I went back to school for a Master's of Science in Renewable Energy, started teaching renewable energy at Macomb Community College at night school. So I've been reading about energy for my whole life. In November of last year, the Michigan Congress passed and the governor signed a series of 6 different energy-related bills. I'm going to go through and talk about each one of these individually, but here's kind of the summary of all 6. The biggest one, the most important from a climate change perspective, was the Senate Bill 217. So Michigan has a clean energy portfolio. This past many years ago, it was initially 10%. It got increased to 15%. That's the percentage of an electric utility's generation that must come from renewable sources. And by the way, I didn't say this, but we've got a nice small group here. So feel free to stop me and ask questions. I encourage that, right? I want this to be meaningful for you, especially if I say something you don't understand. So Senate Bill 217 increases that clean energy portfolio from 15% today to 50% in 2030. In 2035, it's got dual requirements, 60% renewable and 80% clean. Now, what's the difference? In the legal definition, clean energy includes nuclear energy and natural gas-fired power plants if they're equipped with carbon capture and storage of at least 90% of the CO2 that's produced. So 60% renewable, 80% clean allows for some nuclear and or natural gas with CCS to be included. And then 2040, 100% clean. It also requires electric utilities to create a storage plan to put in 2,500 megawatts of storage. They have to have a plan by the end of the year in 2029. It's a lot of storage. I don't know why they gave them that much time. That's a long time from now, but that's what the law says.
Is that each
John,
utility or is that the total?
That is the total for the utilities of the state, and there was a docket to figure out how to divide that amongst the different utilities. I have that docket number if you want. I'm not sure. I don't know if that's been resolved yet or not.
can you clarify what is due by the end of 2029, the plan or the storage?
I believe it is the plan. Yes.
So any idea when the storage is supposed to be in?
That's a fabulous question, and I don't know. It's an obvious question, right? I should have been prepared for that one. The commission's also going to do a study on long-term storage, meaning more than 10 hours, and multi-day storage systems within a year. So the commission kind of got a task out of this law too. Now, this is going to force the utilities to make a lot more renewable energy. They have been moving that direction. They each have a clean energy plan and, insist that they're the greenest company around, yada, yada. So I just picked DTE because they're the largest utility in Michigan and I live in their area. And they had the most recent integrated resource plan. So the graph on the right is directly out of DTE's integrated resource plan that was approved in 2022. Go ahead.
I have a question. Why would the nuclear go down between 36 and 42?
It's going down as a percentage, right? So
Yeah, but you still have your plant. You're not closing a plant.
Correct.
So
The
wouldn't it
presumption
still
is they're
be
making more electricity overall. So the percentage of the electricity that's nuclear is going down because it's the same amount of nuclear production.
Okay.
What is an integrated resource plan?
Thank you. So there's a provision in Michigan law, and a number of states do this, but not all of them, that requires every 5 years for electric utilities to create an integrated resource plan, and it's a contested case before the Public Service Commission. The utility must show their plan for how they're going to meet. First, they have to project electrical demand over the next 20 years, and they have to show how they're going to meet it in 5, 10, 15, and 20 years. So it's basically what plants are they going to retire? What plants are they going to build or purchase? Or what power purchase agreements are they going to enter into? How are they going to meet demand in the long range? It's a very good law. I'm kind of surprised not every state does this, but they don't. And it's my favorite kind of case to intervene in, right? Because really important long-term decisions are made. The average life of a power plant in this country is around 60 years. So the coal plants that are retiring all around the country, they're all right around my age. It's funny. And so those are cases where really long-term decisions are made. Every time we build a power plant of whatever kind, it's a tremendous long-term impact in a variety of ways, but certainly in terms of climate change.
Was this graph made in 2005 or in like 3% of total energy storage existed in 2005?
It did, yes. So Michigan is blessed with the Ludington Pumped Storage Facility.
And is that DTE? That's DTE?
It is half DTE and half Consumers Energy. It was a joint project.
I see.
And I think it was actually 5149, but I don't remember which direction. Anyway, they built that back in the 70s when they were building nuclear plants, when they're doing Fermi, and I think the consumers one was Cook. And the idea was that they wanted to run the nukes at full capacity all night, and there wasn't enough demand, right? There wasn't enough electricity demand for that much power. So they built Ludington so that at night they pump water up the hill into an artificial lake when they have that excess capacity. And then during the day, when they need the power, they let it run down through turbines and generate power. It's pumped storage is not rare. It's actually quite common across the country, across the world. It's not real common in the US, and Ludington is, I think, the biggest one in the United States.
Right.
Very cool facility. They built it back in the 70s.
Uh-huh.
It will be useful with renewables because it is storage. It acts like batteries. Its
Sure.
ramp time isn't quite as fast, but it's pretty good.
Sure. So the data here for 2023 are not actuals, but are
Correct.
projections made in 2005.
No, made in 2022. So they showed
Oh,
2005 just for sort of historical reference because they wanted to brag about how many coal plants they'd closed.
I see.
You see the amount of coal dropped a lot between
Right.
2005 and 2023.
But they actually have 14% in renewables now.
Well, they have to. The law stipulates 15, so I do wonder how, well, I do know how they're getting by with that. They had produced some ahead of the law and saved up renewable energy certificates.
Uh-huh.
Well, would Ludington count as renewable in the law versus
No.
storage? Okay.
You see my note at the bottom. They're showing storage as generation, and this really annoys me because it's not generation, right? Yes, it does generate power, but it only generates power from power it's stored. So it's very confusing to me that they're saying this is generation mix as a percentage of megawatt hours, and they're including storage as if it creates energy, and it doesn't. So yeah, I'm certainly not going to let them get away with that in the next IRP if they try. Um,
Yep.
yep. So they were projecting that they'll be at 31% renewable energy in 2029, but the law is requiring 50%. So that's 20, well, 50% in 2030. 2030 is not that long away. It takes, years to get a new power plant constructed. It used to be we could put in wind and solar really quick. Some of those were put in less than a year. But now with the interconnect queues at MISO, which I can explain if you like, it can take 3 years just to get approval. They were projecting in 2036 that they'd have 51% renewable, and I'm adding the renewables and nuclear and saying 64% clean. The law is going to require 60% renewable and 80% clean. So my point of this slide is just this is really going to push the utilities to develop a lot more renewable energy. It does have an off ramp. They can petition the MPSC for an extension of 2 years, conceivably repeatedly, if they can show cause that trying to meet the plan would reduce reliability or be prohibitively expensive. That may happen. We will see. We have to prepare to fight that case. The law also changed the way that, or added really, a bonus profit incentive for utilities. The way utilities are regulated, their profit is regulated as basically a percent return on all their capital investment. You could argue they're not really in the business of making electricity, they're in the business of investing capital because that's how they make profit. So consequently, they were very reticent to sign power purchase agreements with a third party, right? Some other company builds a solar farm and then says, we will sell you the power from this for usually it's 20 years, or it's the term length of a power purchase agreement. And the utilities just didn't want to do that because they don't make a profit on it, even though often that was cheaper than the solar or wind farms they were building. And so the law inserted this profit incentive for them to sign long-term power purchase agreements. I actually think the law overdid it and the incentive is too rich. But we'll see. I'm waiting to see if this really changes the utilities, you know, bias in the next case. Near and dear to my heart, it also made changes to the distributed generation program. So let me talk about that a little bit. So we used to have net metering. If you put solar on your house, and most of the states still do. At one point, it was, I think, 44 states had net metering, and that's dropping. And Michigan was one of the ones that dropped. So we had net metering. If you had solar on your house, when you were generating more power than you were using, and you exported some of that power to the grid, which usually just ran across the line to your next door neighbor, you would get you would get a credit at the same rate that the utility charged you, right? So if you were paying 20 cents a kilowatt hour power you gave back to them, you got 20 cents a kilowatt hour. That changed by law to this distributed generation tariff. It comes out to around half of the retail rate. So you're paying, now it's more like 25 cents a kilowatt hour, you export and you get, 13 cents a kilowatt hour. So it's very poor compared to net metering from the solar owner's perspective. A number of states have done that. They're referred to as successor tariffs, something that replaced net metering. Michigan is unique. We not only did away with net metering and replaced it with a rather poor successor tariff, but there was also a cap in the law that said the utilities didn't have to do that if the output of all those solar systems was more than 1% of their peak summer load. The utilities starting hitting this. We were fighting this in cases and signing kind of bad settlements that got them to up that percentage. The law now took that all away and said, no, the new cap, it still is a cap, but it's 10% of peak load instead of 1%. That's going to give us quite a number of years of growth. It also increased the maximum size of the solar systems. You look at a residential solar system, they're typically 5 or 6 kilowatts, but on commercial systems, we're seeing much larger ones, particularly on like big box stores where they have a lot of roof area and they have a lot of demand for air conditioning and lighting, those huge buildings. It used to be the distributed generation program was limited to systems under 150 kilowatts. This increased the maximum system size to 550 kilowatts and or 110% of the customer's usage. So you can't put a oversized system on your house or business and kind of get in the business of selling electricity to the utility. It really has to be designed to meet your own needs. Importantly, it also established a uniform application process. It used to be what the developer had to do. The application process for each electric utility was different. And most of our solar installers operate across the entire state. So that was a huge pain for them. There's now going to be a uniform application. It just got released from the MPSC this week. So that should take a little bit of burden off of solar developers.
Are there any differences between individual systems and large business systems? You know, like if some of the warehouses put up their systems, they would just be limited to 550?
Yes. There is also a distinction made between systems smaller than 20 kilowatts or between 20 and 550 in terms of the cap. Half of the cap is reserved for those small systems, which is pretty much residential, and half of it for larger systems. So they put that in to ensure that a couple of big box chains didn't consume the entire cap, right? There's half of it set aside for small residential systems.
Yeah, because they're talking about some of these data centers and the amount of electricity that they require. And it strikes me that a 550 is probably very small for what their needs are.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Some of the data centers are 100 times that size. But they don't have enough roof area, right? They're very intense users of electricity. The buildings aren't that giant. They could certainly put it in the yard next to them. There's a bunch of discussion. somewhere in the country, I can't remember where, one of the data centers is trying to sign a special sort of side deal with a nuclear plant to purchase a lot of their output and at a very beneficial rate. And there's a whole discussion about sort of pro-nuclear side. I just saw a presentation last night. We have to build more nuclear plants to power all the data centers and
Right.
AI that's being built because they're 24/7, load, and that's what nuclear produces. So that's what we need to do. I disagree with that analysis, but there's certainly a lot of talk about that. So the law also changed renewable energy plans. So those are the programs, that the cases at the MPSC that the utilities have to file to show how they're going to meet the clean energy standard. Now that was 15%. They kind of got there. It became sort of an accounting thing about how they were going to recover the costs of that. Now these are going to be really important cases. They're sort of going to displace some of the importance of IRPs. They're going to make big decisions in these renewable energy plans because pretty much everything they're going to build is going to be renewable. So they have to file new cases. DTE is first coming up, which, gee, July 19th already passed, so that's got to be filed somewhere. I haven't read that case yet. Then consumers and the others. So the renewable energy plans are shorter term, but I think in the next IRPs, they're gonna, which are also scheduled for next year, somebody's probably DTE is going to propose a new nuclear plant. It's kind of bizarre because it takes 20 years to get one built, so I don't see how that would fit into the program. There will probably be a proposal to, put carbon capture on either existing gas plants or build new gas plants that will have carbon capture. There's a little bit of magical thinking in that there aren't any power plants with an effective carbon capture and storage system in operation in this country, and I think there's one in the world. Um, so, yeah, can you really pull that off? There's a large underground geological formation in Indiana and Illinois that the DOE has done testing on and said, yes, this is suitable for storing CO2 underground in. So we may see proposals to run. It's one of the biggest problems with carbon capture. First of all, it costs a lot of money and expends a lot of energy to clean the CO2 out of the exhaust plumes from a gas plant. But then you have to take it somewhere. It's very unlikely that your power plant is built on top of a suitable place to store carbon. So they're going to run a pipeline probably down to Illinois or Indiana and try and store it there. And everywhere this has been tried, there's massive local opposition to building the pipelines. Questions on this?
With these renewable energy plants, is that where they would also be including any kind of wind that they want to put in?
Oh yeah, that'll be solar and wind for sure, and potentially nuclear or natural gas with carbon capture, or biomass qualifies. Anaerobic digesters, burning wood, in power plants, all that sort of thing.
Okay, thanks.
The law has a whole list of explicitly what things are included. Horribly, one of the things they count as renewables is an incinerator that burns old tires. I don't even know what to say about that. So Michigan utilities must also file energy waste reduction programs, basically energy efficiency, every 2 years. In the past, it was just the regulated utilities. Now with law SB 273, non-regulated co-ops and munis must file every 4 years as well. They have to have a plan about how they're going to reduce electricity use in their own jurisdiction. There is a profit incentive for utilities hitting a certain goal, and this increases the goal a little bit. But interestingly, it includes electrification programs, which is sort of backwards, right? If you electrify stuff, you increase electric use instead of reducing it, but you're presumably reducing gas use. It also includes building envelope improvements, which was never part of energy waste reduction, but probably should have been. And it also provides that 25% of what the utilities spend on energy waste reduction has to be directed to low-income customers. And so in cases, the MPSC the law has, an SB 502, has enlarged the criteria by which the MPSC can evaluate the plans proposed by the utilities. In the past, it was really kind of restricted to how does it meet demand economically and keep the utilities, in compliance with EPA mandates, right? It has now expanded it to include criteria pollutants, which was always there. Those are the ones regulated by the EPA. The clean energy standard, well, of course, that's the new law, but also reductions in harms to health, safety, and the welfare of environmental justice communities, and the degree to which it promotes environmental quality and public health. That's a huge change. So we can now argue, you need to close this coal plant because the poisons it's blowing out of its smokestacks are killing people. I've argued that before, but the Public Service Commission really couldn't consider that, as bizarre as that may sound. SB 519 is, help for transitioning workers. There's this concern there's going to be layoffs in the coal industry, which Michigan doesn't really have one, but in coal power plants, in transportation, if we're switching to electricity, refining, we do have oil refineries, building and construction trades. I find that a little odd. There's actually going to be more employment there because there's a lot of retrofits that we need to do to make buildings more energy efficient. The law doesn't really have a lot of teeth. It establishes a new department with a director, and they're supposed to do coordination and collaboration and create a economic transition plan and look around and try and find sources of funding, but it doesn't allocate any money to this.
Right, so they've created a plan that they have to do something, but they're not giving them money to do it.
In this law. Now, maybe once the plan's created, then a future budget will allocate funds to it. I think maybe that's the idea. Or there's certainly, I think the biggest part of this is to try and sweep up federal grant money, right? There is so much, so many different programs and money coming out of the federal government, and states are all kind of scrambling to figure out how to grab as much of it as they can. Of course, depending on the election in November, that may dramatically change. And then the siting of large wind and solar, House Bill 5120. This is probably the most controversial element of the new laws. It only applies to solar systems of 50 megawatts or more. Now to put that in perspective, solar systems around 5 acres per megawatt. So you're looking at 250 acres. These are large utility scale facilities, wind facilities of 100 megawatts or more. So yeah, this isn't going to affect, businesses that are putting up solar. This isn't going to affect a community solar program. This is for utility scale systems. The MPSC is going to set filing requirements for getting siting approval. And then if a local unit of government denies a permit, which is happening on a regular basis, the developer can take it to the MPSC in a contested case and say the local unit of governments is more restrictive than the MPSC's rules, and therefore the MPSC can overrule it. This is very controversial because in Michigan, the permitting decisions have always been done at the local level, and this pulls some permitting authority, siting authority away from local governments and puts it at the state. What strikes me as kind of funny is the MPSC has never been involved in that kind of decision before. So it's a whole new responsibility for that organization. It requires that go ahead.
I had a question. Do you know how many, if there are cases now that are headed there?
There
the
are
fall?
not yet because the MPSC hasn't set the filing requirements yet, right? So they've got to kind of go through a process to set up the rules before anybody can say, well, this local government violated the rules.
Thank you.
It also requires that the developer that is trying to, proposing to get this permit has to fund the community for intervening in the resulting case between 75 and 150,000. I'm not quite sure how they determine how much. I think the MPSC will set that. The commission has a year to grant or deny the applications. They've got a deadline. And the law actually sets some of the standards, right? It has standards in it for solar about how the setbacks, how far away the solar has to be from a residence or from the property line. Forget exactly. It has different ones for wind that instead of a specific number of feet, it's a multiple of the maximum blade tip height. And the applicant also has to pay the local government $2,000 per megawatt of capacity as just kind of a community funding thing. That was the package of 6 bills that were passed in November of last year. More recently here, just this month, the governor signed House Bill 5028, the Homeowners Energy Act. This limits the power of HOAs, homeowners associations, to restrict energy things. Solar panels, probably the most important one, clotheslines, heat pumps, reflective roofing, right? So they can't say, oh, your roof has to be one of these colors. If you want to make your roof white so that it doesn't get hot in the summer, you can do that. Energy efficiency, rain barrels, EV charging stations, right? The homeowners association can't prevent those things. Specifically to solar, which is probably the most important one, the HOA can still create some rules and restrictions, but they cannot reduce the output of the system by more than 10% or increase the cost of the system by more than $1,000. Astounding to me, I didn't know, Michigan has 8,470 HOAs that control 7.2% of all the homes in Michigan, including mine. This bill will take effect 90 days after the legislature adjourns this year. So, it's not in effect yet. And the HOAs then have 1 year to write rules about it. But if in that intervening rule year, some homeowner applies to put solar on their roof, the HOA has 120 days to respond to that. This is near and dear to my heart because I live in an HOA that has banned solar, and I have a nice big south-facing roof, and you better believe I'm going to put solar on it as soon as I can.
John,
Yep.
aren't you in a, you don't have a single family home though, don't you have like a
I
joint?
do. So it's technically we're set up as a co-op, or not a co-op, I can't think of it. Anyway, we don't own the land, but we have a single family detached home that we own. What's up next? So the GLREA has been pushing for community solar for years. We've tried to do that through the MPSC, and they say, yes, we think that's a wonderful idea. We hope the utilities will do it, but honestly, we don't have legal authority to make them do anything that's real community solar. The DTE claims they have a community solar program, but it's ridiculous. So this was discussed at the beginning of the meeting. Community solar allows someone that doesn't own their home or can't put solar on it for some reason to buy a share in the community solar system and get a bill credit as if that solar was on their roof. That's one definition. Anyway, there are a variety of definitions for community solar, but that's what we're looking for. And you might not own your roof. You might be renting a house. You might be in an apartment, or you may own your house, but you've got big trees that shade the roof. That was my condition a year ago, right? I had a nice big south-facing roof, but I had big trees that were shading the house. I was not going to cut them down so I could put solar. So community solar provides that option for a lot of people in different circumstances. We're certainly advocating for that. As it was said, there's bills in the Michigan House and Senate. The utilities are violently opposed to community solar. So that's going to be an uphill fight.
Betty has her hand up.
Okay,
Betty,
great. I can't.
if you want to ask a question.
I do actually, and it has to do with the community solar. When I lived in central Michigan, I was a member of a co-op, and that's how I got my power.
Yes.
Was through this co-op, and it was a great program. I wish that I had co-ops available for me in Southwest Michigan. But anyway, with the community solar, would that operate in a similar manner to the electric co-ops that are in existence now?
Sort of. I mean, you're still going to have the utility that owns the distribution system that's delivering the power to your house and charging you for that. You're still going to get a bill from your utility, not the developer that put up the community solar system and hopefully owns it. So it's not really taking you to the point of a co-op, but it's the community solar system itself would sort of be set up as a co-op, right? But it doesn't entirely displace your utility. It's just generating you a credit on your utility bill.
Okay, thank you.
And Tom had a question.
Yeah, hi, John. I'm wondering about why the utilities so strongly oppose it. I guess it has to do with competition, but yeah, can you go into that a little bit?
Sure. So the primary, well, this isn't what they say, but the real reason is that they make profit by investing capital and owning things. So anything that reduces the amount of stuff they get to own reduces their profit. So if you put solar on your roof, they need less generating power. So it reduces their profit, however slight the amount. If there's a community solar program and there's megawatts of solar going up, they don't own that. They wouldn't oppose community solar much if they owned it. And that's kind of their argument of, well, they have a green power program and that's the same thing. It's not. And so that's the primary objection. But really the other one underlying there is it can kind of make them look bad. If your community solar system is generating power for substantially less than the utility is charging you, then that kind of shows how inefficient they are. So I think that might be another perspective.
Okay, thanks. What do we do to reduce that effect? How can we work with the consumers to encourage them?
So short of redoing the way the state regulates utilities, which there are some very good arguments for doing that, you really just have to make the legislature force them. That they're not going to do this voluntarily. We have tried that in case after case, and neither consumers nor DTE nor Indiana Michigan Power are going to allow this unless they're forced by the legislature.
Thank you.
Okay. So the community solar is purely the electric portion. What happens with the transmission lines?
So community solar is generally small enough that it hooks up to the distribution system rather than the transmission system. There's a subtle difference there.
Okay.
But the utility still owns the distribution system, and they're still gonna own, manage, and charge you for that.
So the utility, in essence, can charge you sort of rent for using their distribution lines?
Yeah, that is sort of the net of it, although it's not going to show that way. You're still going to get a utility bill as if you bought all your electricity from them, and then that will be offset by a credit of your share of the community solar's output.
Okay. Rick, you have a question?
Yeah, so here's where I can distinguish between the utilities, so-called solar gardens, and a community solar. I'm enrolled in the solar Gardens program for consumers energy. And I think someone else on here is also, and it's like the DTE's Green Power Program. And apparently they get, consumers energy gets some REC or a renewable energy credit for making that solar gardens thing in the first place. They're getting some kind of credit to show that they're generating renewable energy, but I'm paying 100% of it. I'm not getting any kind, I'm getting, well, in terms of dollars, to give you a sense, I'm paying $81 a month for 9 shares of solar gardens. And I'm getting a credit back that averages maybe $30 a month. So net is I'm getting an extra $50 charge per month on my utility bill, in addition to the normal utility rates, I mean, that everybody pays.
Yes,
And
this is why a utility-owned program is not the answer. Going to your thing about the renewable energy certificates, those are going against that clean energy requirement, right? So they own that solar system. They therefore own the renewable energy certificates, the greenness of it, and it counts for them against meeting the clean energy standard. I would argue that they should be paying you the value of those renewable energy certificates as well. And I have argued that for I've been fighting this in 2 cases now, and soon to be a third, that for solar home owners, right, that have solar on the roof, they should be paying us for the renewable energy certificates, the greenness of the power, right? You can go to them and say, I want to buy green power from DTE, and they'll charge you an extra 2.5 cents a kilowatt hour, which is substantial. But if you sell them green power from your solar system, they pay you half the retail rate, as if it was brown dirty power, not as if it's green power. So I argued that in a case, and the commission staff agreed with me that the utilities should buy the renewable energy certificates from solar homeowners. And the MPSC kind of was sympathetic to it, but said, well, but we can't make them. I don't know why not. They didn't quite say we can't, but that was sort of the implication. A lot of the commission orders are a little bit vague about reasons. And so we're going to keep fighting that.
And if I were enrolled in a real consumer community solar program, I would be getting some kind of instead of paying $50 extra per month, I would be getting some kind of a credit against my utility bill.
That's the big fight, is how big should that credit be? How should it be computed, right? But we can't even get there because the utilities don't want to agree to have anything like this. So
Okay.
Okay.
their argument is that the credit should be the wholesale price of energy, which is like 4 cents a kilowatt hour, while they're charging us, 20, 25. It's just absurd.
Bridget, your hand is up.
Yes. Hi, John, and hi, everyone. Thanks for letting me join this call. As an intern with GLREA, I'm trying to absorb as much knowledge as possible, and you all have asked some awesome questions, so I'm learning a lot. But John, I had a question for you. I wasn't sure if we've talked about this in a policy meeting before. I'm sure we have, but when I went on a tour of some local solar arrays and a local wind park in Southeast Michigan about a month ago, there were some representatives from the utilities at these different sites, and one of the arguments that one of the representatives, I think from consumers, made against community solar is that I think he said 2 things. One, that it's going to be too hard to find enough land in sort of these more residential areas to actually place community solar. Whereas a lot of the sites right now are in more rural areas. So I guess where there's more demand and more residential sort of suburban areas, they feel like there's just not going to be enough land or people willing to site things on land that's closer to where they're living. And then the second argument they had is that it's just not cost effective. And I was just wondering how you feel about those arguments. I mean, I could probably guess, but I was just wondering.
Yeah. So the first one is sort of beside the point. So let's pass the law. And if it turns out that no developer can manage to cite one of these, then there's no harm done, right? So the citing at that point ceases to be the utility's problem. So why are they even talking about it? The second thing, in terms of economics, this is again always their argument. They say putting solar on roofs is silly because it's so much more economical on a per kilowatt basis to build giant facilities. This misses the point. It's comparing apples to oranges. So the giant utility solar systems are connected to the transmission grid, and you have to pay considerable money to run the power through the transmission system and the distribution system and then get it to the end point of use. And if you look at your bill, that amounts to more than half of the total cost, right? So a giant utility scale system is competing with other power plants, which are selling electricity for around 4 cents a kilowatt hour. A rooftop system is competing with retail electricity, which is selling for 20 or 25 cents a kilowatt hour. You can't compare those two. Yes, on a per kilowatt basis, the rooftop one costs more than the giant field, but the giant field incurs additional costs in getting that electricity to the point of end use, to the customer. Whereas if it's co-sited, it doesn't. Community solar kind of falls in the middle of that, right? It's closer to the end point and therefore has a cost advantage there. It's not as big as the utility system, but it's still big enough to get substantial economies of scale. If you look at the price per kilowatt of a system, a utility scale system is, I'm just going to make this really round, around $1 a watt, and a rooftop residential system is around $3 a watt. That's a huge difference. But you get to a community solar scale system of a megawatt or 10 megawatts. I think the price comes down to like $1.50 a watt. So it's more expensive than the giant utility system, but it's near the community and eliminates the transmission system and most of the distribution system costs, and is therefore still a good deal. But the economics are complicated, and it's easy for the utilities to say, we're the experts on this, trust us, it's not economical.
Yeah, great point. Yeah. And also, like, economics aside, I think it's important to consider that people may be willing to pay a little bit more to be energy independent too. So I think those are great points. So I'll keep that in mind next time I'm in front of a utility worker or executive who's trying to argue that with me.
So going a step further, right? In the interest of resilience, we need to set up microgrids, right? 2000 and what was it, 13 or 2000? Yeah, where we had the giant power outage that ran across half the country. Remember that? That should never happen. It should be impossible for one tree hitting one line in Ohio to black out half the country, right? We need to break the grid into separate autonomous units that operate together, but in times of stress can disconnect from the rest of the system and operate independently. Community solar is ideally suited for that, right? And so that's an additional argument for a community solar system.
Tom?
Yeah, following up on the community solar, what about rooftop solar then? I mean, the argument there would be even bigger probably, that it's inefficient, and yet it's free at some level. I mean, after you pay for it, I'm told after 15 years it'll be free. And meanwhile, I'm reducing the amount of CO2 I'm putting into the air. So to me, that's the benefit right now. I start reducing CO2 today. So what would the energy companies say about that?
Yeah, well, they make the same argument, and it's completely tangential. It misdirects the discussion, right? They're used to thinking of sort of society, thinking like like a government, right? Societal costs, right? We're going to produce energy at the lowest societal cost, which they don't, but they claim that. And the rooftop solar system is economically inefficient. It's completely irrelevant. As a homeowner, I decide if I want to invest my money in that, right? Nobody comes into your house and says, you spent money on granite countertops? That's economically inefficient. Right? It's absurd, right? I own it. I bought it. I paid my money. The utility has no damn business in the matter, right? So that's number one in the starting point. Secondly, people put solar on their roof for a multitude of reasons, some of which are economic and some of which are not. Yes, we do want to feel we are individually reducing our contribution to greenhouse gases. And it gives you resilience. You can produce power when the utility's having outages. I just had an outage here 2 nights ago, right? That's the biggest reason. About half of new residential solar systems being installed in Michigan have a battery system. And battery systems don't pay for themselves from the perspective of, yeah, you can do some rate arbitrage, right? And you can store the energy and reuse it yourself later, and that saves you some money. But they really aren't they don't price out very well from that perspective yet. They're getting cheaper. They will soon. But that's not why people buy them. People buy them because they want to have power during a power outage. And power outages are getting more frequent across the country, and particularly in Michigan. DTE service in particular is lousy. And that's why people do it, right? But there's other reasons. You might people buy a Mercedes because they want to show off to people, right? I'd rather show off my greenness than show off my wealth, right? I want to inspire my neighbors to put solar on their roof. And guess what? It works. There have been studies that show that the biggest indication of whether solar is going to get installed in a given community is if somebody else in that community has already done it. Somebody has to break the ice, and the neighbors come over and look at it and go, well, gosh, I guess this is real. Hey, Tom, does that thing really work? How'd that work? How did you go about that? How did you get started? And suddenly they're doing it, right? Which is why the GLREA is running a program called Solarize, Michigan Solarize. And it's small community groups meeting, and we bring in a developer, but it's run by a homeowner who has solar. And they do the presentation and say, this is my experience of a solar system. And they're credible because they're not trying to sell you anything, right? And they're your neighbor. And it works. And so that's a tremendously useful program that we're running, and I should have mentioned earlier. So there's all kinds of reasons why someone might put solar on their house. And in fact, it is economical, particularly if you don't add the battery system. But that's your decision. And you know what? The economics actually depend on your required rate of return. So if you're in debt and you're paying 18% on your credit cards, putting solar on your roof is a terrible investment. If you're retired and you're living off of your savings and you're investing them in treasury bills that are paying 4 or 5%, solar is actually a very good investment. So it is somewhat individual, right? The utilities look at return on investment at around 10%. So yeah, that's not such a good investment if a homeowner was doing that, right? But it's not their business anyway.
Thank you.
I have a completely different question. What's it called? Green Mountain in Vermont has put batteries into people's homes that they then fill at night, sort of like Bloodington, so that when they have their peak, they don't have to adjust the amount of electricity they're producing. They use the batteries that they filled the previous evening. Is this anything that consumers or Michigan is looking into doing?
Fabulous question. I'm glad you asked that. I'm familiar with Green Mountain Power's program, and I believe I've even cited it in testimony. In the current case with the DTE rate case, it's number 21534. I'm a witness in that. My testimony is going to get filed today. But I'll give you a sneak peek. DTE's just got approval to install 220 megawatts of batteries in one location. They're going to drop them in a coal plant in Trenton, Trenton something anyway, that they shut down, and they're going to drop the batteries in because there's a big transmission facility in there. And what my testimony says is that's a stupid way to install batteries. You ought to install them in much smaller lumps spread across the state, co-located with your substations. And that will then relieve the load on the substations, so that you don't have to upgrade them, because they want to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to upgrade substations. And it also sets you up to establish microgrids at those substation level, so that if there's a total grid outage, the substation can disconnect from the grid and power its local community for a little while, right? Maybe not as long as the power outage lasts, maybe, right? A lot of power outages are short. But also it allows you to then actually issue warning to your customers and say, your power is going to turn off in an hour, right? Prepare for that. That's especially important to certain commercial and industrial users, that they can shut down their industrial process and not have their molten metal suddenly solidify in the wrong place because they couldn't keep it hot. Horrible things like that. Even a place like a grocery store could rev up their refrigerators and freezers to get a little colder to ride out the coming power outage, right? There's all kinds of things they can do if they have forewarning. So yeah, my testimony is arguing that they should divide it up much smaller, to power small parts of the grid, and control voltage and frequency regulation, at the local level, rather than putting a giant lump of it in one place, which is just plain stupid. And they're going to install a lot more batteries, and I'm afraid that if the commission doesn't make them do otherwise, they're going to just keep doing the same thing. Each old coal plant is going to become a battery station, which is useful, but it's a huge investment. It could be so much more useful if they broke it up. I am not particularly wild about the idea of utilities owning anything that's inside a customer's home, or building. But yeah, there is some merit to that. The problem is a homeowner wants to put in batteries so that they have power when the power goes off. The utility wants to operate those batteries so that basically long about 7, 8 o'clock, they're dead, right? They've drained all the power out when they needed it. If the power outage is then, you're kind of out of luck. There have been, I think Green Mountain Power does a thing where they keep the batteries largely charged if there's a storm coming. So most of our power outages are sort of semi-predictable in that they occur in certain weather conditions, right? There's a storm with high winds, there's an ice storm, there's heavy sticky snow expected, right? And so they stop discharging your batteries and keep them charged up when those kind of weather conditions are expected, but use them for the utilities benefit the rest of the time. That's a pretty good balance if you work that out right.
What's your question?
Do we have a separation of the generation of energy from the transmission and distribution part? I mean, supposedly there's other companies I can buy from. I think I see it on my utility bill. I can go out and shop. Instead of using consumers' energy, I can get my energy from some other company. I haven't tried it, but
Yeah,
is there competition?
So which utility district are you in?
Consumers' energy?
Okay, so the real answer is no, you can't. It looks like you can. So it's retail wheeling, and it was introduced in Michigan some time ago. Initially, it was unlimited, but then in a later law, the legislature capped it at 10% of the utilities, sales, and that all immediately got sold because people wanted to get out from under the utilities, and there's a long waiting list. So yes, you can sign up for that, and maybe someday, years from now, you'll actually be able to do it. But that's the limitation on that. The utilities did spin off their transmission back in that time period, and so we have a separate company called ITC that owns the transmission in Michigan. So that's the high voltage stuff, the things where you have towers rather than poles generally. But the utilities own both the generation and the distribution. If I were king, one of the first things I would do is separate that and say the regulated utilities will own only the distribution system, and all of power generation will be individual developers the utilities will sign long-term power purchase agreements with. And we just take that generation ownership out of the utilities' hands. I don't believe any state has actually done that. So, it's just a fantasy of mine.
So are there any other questions, comments? Okay, so John, thank you. I think you gave us a lot of food for thought.